Welcome back to Radio Taiwan International. You're listening to Geek Out. What's your cup of tea, tickles your fancy, or floats your boat? Join us as we share passions from people in Taiwan and around the world. I'm your host, Michelle Cheng, and today in the studio we have back my very good friend, Max.
It's great to be here.
So what are we geeking out about today?
We are geeking out about a particular kind of innovation.
Yes.
And in the progress of civilization, we are going towards stronger medicines, better technology, refining ourselves in many ways. And today we're talking about perhaps the apogee of gaming.
Yes.
The ultimate game.
Okay, like you said, humans are trying to advance every aspect of our lives, and recreation is a big, giant aspect of it. Gaming especially. Listeners, you guys have listened to us wax romantic about stuff like D&D. Your topic today has actually quite a bit to do with it.
It does. It comes out of the history of D&D.
Yeah.
It was a adaptation of D&D for the computer originally that gave us a game called Rogue.
Yes.
That then, after many, many decades of slumber, birthed a new genre of games called the Roguelike.
Yeah.
Which I am a big fan of.
Yeah.
And the gameplay mechanics behind the Roguelike I think of as being close to the perfect gameplay experience.
Yeah. Okay, so to clarify, the idea of rogues is they proceed through cities or dungeons or whatever. They tussle with enemies, they rob people, they try to accomplish tasks like this. So Rogue, I imagine, I've never played the actual original game, but it's an ASCII?
It's an ASCII graphics-based dungeon crawling hack and slash game.
Exactly, for single player.
For single player. So the most direct descendant of that original game might be something like Diablo.
Oh, right.
The Diablo series is very closely related to the original Rogue. In Rogue, you can choose different classes.
Yep.
The Rogue class, the Barbarian class, Wizard class, many different classes.
Cool.
All the D&D classes basically are there. But because this was a game that was released in 1980, this is before Mario, before Pac-Man.
Absolutely, before 8-bit.
Before 8-bit. This is very, very basic. The amount of memory that was available to store the level design was very, very small. So it turned out that it was cheaper computationally to randomly generate the levels every time.
Wow, I did not know that.
So it was a limitation of the hardware of the time
that created the most interesting aspect of the Rogue game.
Right. So one of the important parts of Rogue and of Roguelikes that came later was every time you play the game, it's a little bit different because the levels have been generated through a random algorithm.
Oh, I love it. And people today who are used to playing more modern video games or tabletop gaming, that is one element of a game that makes it much more interesting every time you play the game, because I'm of the school of thought where I don't want to play the exact same thing so many times. It gets boring, right? So if you have that random bunch of deck resource pool cards or random map or something that gets generated, it makes it really cool. It
puts the replayability through the roof, potentially.
Yes.
If the other elements of the game design are done well. Having an essentially new game to play every time you restart can keep people playing the same game for a very long time.
Very long time. Essentially forever.
Essentially. And there are roguelikes that still have a dedicated fan community around them decades after their release.
Right.
Not to say anything of the original Rogue, which is now over 4 decades old and still has people playing it and designing it and developing it.
That's amazing. Okay, so one aspect of a rogue-like game is the randomly generated...
The randomly generated levels, the randomly generated item drops
that
you essentially each time you play it are going to be different. The second important part of a roguelike's DNA is permadeath.
Yes.
Once you die in a roguelike, there is no continues, there's no save states. You go back to the very beginning.
Yes. In D&D terminology, you are dead.
You are dead. There is no, it was all a dream. There's no retconning.
Nope.
You go back to the beginning. So that is something that I think Rogue shared with arcade games of the time, right? If you died, you ran out of continues, you have to go back to the very beginning. However, the difference is that in a arcade-style game, the level 1 that you return to is the same level 1 that you started on.
Correct.
It never really changes that much. So it's mostly getting good at an arcade game is about remembering a series of steps.
Yes.
Remembering a series of jumps or timing or encounters that then, as long as your memory is good enough, you could potentially play it perfectly.
Exactly. With your eyes closed.
With your eyes closed. However, a roguelike has enough randomness in it that you really cannot sleepwalk through even level 1.
Yeah.
Even if you go back to level 1 in a Mario game and you're an expert Mario player, you can sleepwalk through it, basically. Level 1 in a roguelike, you cannot sleepwalk even from the beginning because the difficulty presents itself right away, and mistakes that you make early on in the game will cost you dearly later on.
And possibly you'd be dead really quickly.
You could be dead very quickly, or you could be dead many levels down the line based on a small mistake that you made early on. You have chip damage, some kind of defect in your play style that then compounds and catches up with you later on.
Okay. So, well, this is super intriguing already. So, roguelike games. Can you give some examples of maybe other ones besides
the original Rogue? They have to separate it into two classes because it's such an old game that the original category of roguelikes were games also designed in ASCII, also hack and slash games, sort of like NetHack, Addom. These were all freeware or close to free, open source games that had a long fan base and still are played to this day. Those all look very much the same. Then there is a new generation of roguelikes that have come out within the last 10 years, which superficially look nothing like the original Rogue.
Oh, yeah.
They encompass many different genres. So, for example, there is a twin-stick shooter type game called The Binding of Isaac or Enter the Gungeon that has these roguelike mechanics of permadeath and random level generation.
Right.
There are games that resemble the original Metroid, like Dead Cells.
Oh, I love the old graphics of Metroid.
Sure, and pixel art is a big part of the appeal of a lot of these roguelikes. There are deck-building games like Slay the Spire, and all of these games on the surface look nothing alike. The genres are as diverse as games can be. There's even a roguelike pinball game.
What?
The name escapes me at the moment, but
we'll look that up.
But it is something that is adaptable to many, many different genres. But once you start playing a roguelike, you know what you're in for. You know that it's a roguelike very quickly because you die very quickly.
Yeah.
And as soon as you die and go back to the beginning, you say, okay, just one more run.
Yeah.
Just one more time. And then 15 more times later, you look up and it is well past your bedtime.
Oh, totally. It's 4 a.m. And maybe your eyes are all bloodshot and dry from staring at the screen. I get that.
There's something very satisfying and addictive about the gameplay loop of a roguelike that keeps people coming back again and again and again.
Yeah. I am, as listeners know, not so much of a video game player. I'm very large into tabletop. And the tabletop games that I kind of would liken to this is stuff like Betrayal, House on the Hill, games like Dominion, what else? Well, everyone has actually probably heard of Settlers of Catan, where the map is randomly generated every time, or the resource pools are generated every time, so that each subsequent game that you play is different. And because of the layout of the map or the resources that are presented to you, either items or whatever, it then also changes the mechanics slightly, which means different strategies in how you should play. I imagine this is the same.
These games that you mentioned, they represent a refinement of the original randomization process in a board game, which was dice.
Yeah.
Which is a way to randomize the gameplay, but in the modern era of both board and video games, I think is a pretty primitive way of randomizing.
Yes.
But when you randomize the tile layout of the map, when you randomize the goals that are expected of players, that you really have no idea what's going to unfold, there's a kind of emergent aspect of the game that then it becomes very satisfying.
Yeah.
That from a very small set of simple rules, each game can be dramatically different.
Yes, I think that makes it the most exciting to play these kinds of games.
Definitely.
Absolutely. So most roguelike games are single player.
They are single player, that is true. By and large, they're a single player experience. Some have co-op, so you can play together.
Okay.
PvP, or player versus player roguelikes, are rare. Although if you look at the original, one of the original forebears, I think roguelikes share some DNA with poker.
Please explain. Please explain.
So poker is a game that has randomization as part of its process,
Yes.
obviously.
Yeah.
And yet, skilled poker players can come out as winners consistently over time. They consistently beat the random number god.
Yes.
And their ability to do that is contingent on knowing the psychology of the other player, but also knowing how to use the resources they have at hand to play and chart the best path towards a victory. And so one of the hallmarks of a roguelike is you are at the mercy of the random generation of items, the random generation of maps, of enemies. However, once you get good at the game, once you become better at the game and you anticipate how to react in a very large variety of random situations, you can consistently beat the
levels,
game, beat the levels over and over and over again, despite them being different every time.
Yeah, and therefore difficult.
Very difficult. And it does keep your attention on the screen. Like it requires a lot of attention, which as a game player is satisfying.
Absolutely.
Right? A game that you can sort of sleepwalk through.
Yeah. It gets boring.
It's less satisfying, right?
Absolutely. And you mentioned the random number god. And what makes a good roguelike is that, I mean, because you suffered, death, and you're reset at level 1, does that not make you feel like it's just super negative?
I think it requires a certain personality to enjoy roguelikes, who enjoys challenge, or who doesn't feel too defeated. A good roguelike doesn't make you dwell too much on dying before it punts you right back into the action. The feedback between your death and the next playthrough is as small as possible. So you're immediately playing again. You're not thinking about how unfair the random number god was to you in this situation. I think that a good roguelike plays with randomness in a similar way, and tell me if this has been your experience as a DM for D&D. There's a certain amount of randomness that can hamper a player, and as a DM, what is your role in dealing with the RNG, the random number god? How do you relate as a DM to random number gods?
Any D&D player has been through that, where you just consistently roll just really crappily, and it puts a damper on the game. Now, because we're behind the DM screen, we can totally just pull something out or fudge a roll to bring that player up, either by encounter or adventure, some kind of aspect. But that is a responsibility of the dungeon master to make the game fun. I would imagine that is a huge responsibility of the game designers for roguelike games as well, to create a roguelike game where the player is not just feeling defeated from repeatedly being beaten down by the random number god.
There's definitely a spread in roguelikes where there are certain games where you are at the whim of randomness, and there are games where you feel that even no matter what cards you are dealt, you have some strategies at your disposal. Now, one way that a roguelike will do that is something called meta progression, where on a run through, you might unlock a new ability or a new weapon. Now, when you die, you will go back to level 1 without any of your abilities. However, that ability that you unlocked may be available more easily or more often in the future. So your subsequent runs, you have more cards at your disposal. You have more abilities to choose from. Whether you get those abilities or not are random. But because you have a larger and larger pool of strategies to draw from, then your ability to combine these molecules into a strand of DNA, you're able to combine these pieces into a legitimate strategy more easily.
But we were actually talking over whiskey brownie cinnamon roll dessert earlier about the fact that because roguelike games can be, they're designed to be very difficult. Either because of the structure of the game or just by the random generatedness of the mechanics, that it's really, really exciting and adrenaline filled when the player does somehow happen upon a random pairing of like Thanos' gauntlet.
So a big part of what makes roguelikes so appealing is that there is synergy built in between different items, different strategies, different upgrades, so that by itself a certain item might be middle class or middling in its abilities, but combined with another randomly, achieved item, these two together, you can start to fuse a strategy, fuse a weapon that suddenly boosts you in ability way beyond what you would have expected.
Right.
There are so many different items with so many different interacting properties that a good roguelike, more often than not, will give you unexpected emergent strategies that you hadn't really considered before. And because, as you said, roguelikes are traditionally very punishing.
Yep.
Like you die and you die and you die and you die.
Yeah.
And you die.
Yeah.
When you get a certain combination of items or synergies that suddenly you feel like you've been given godlike power to steamroll through all of the problems and enemies who have harassed you up until that point, you have a big boost of adrenaline, your dopamine, I suppose, is given a lot of massaging.
Yeah, totally.
However, the other trademark of roguelikes is that the difficulty is scaling. It scales in a kind of exponential fashion. So you could be a demigod on level 2, but by level 4 or 5, you are a bug again. You cannot rest. You have to constantly be developing strategies. You have to constantly be thinking about challenges that come later on. And the hallmark of any really good game, I think, is that it's easy to learn but difficult to master.
Yes.
And roguelikes are famously very, very difficult to master. But when you do, you have a huge sense of accomplishment because everything has been set against you up until that point.
That's the point. Playing games, if it's too easy, there is no sense of accomplishment. That's honestly, I think, the core of gameplay, period. It has to be a challenge. It has to be interesting. It has to make your mind work, and you have to figure out strategies on how to beat this challenge that's in front of you. So
very much so. And the hallmark of a good roguelike is that it has difficulty, but it is fair difficulty. And this is a little bit easier to know than it is to define, but the way to contrast this is to cheap difficulty, which is how a lot of older arcade games, older, say, NES games, would keep people putting quarters into the machine. And it was partly because of the need for money to come in. It was also part of the limitations of the hardware. But so, for example, a cheap video game death would be an enemy that you cannot see suddenly comes on screen and knocks you into a pit.
Yeah.
But you had no reaction time. There was no way to avoid it.
Yes.
Right? Or you have enemies that give you knockback. They change the trajectory of your jumping and movement. They cause you to spin out immediately rather than to adjust to the hit that you took.
Right.
These are the classic screw yous of video games. A good roguelike is punishing and you die many times, but every time you die, you feel like, oh, I should have known. I could have beaten it. There was always the sense that if I had just done something a little bit differently, it would have been possible.
Right, the outcome would have been different.
And then that encourages you to go right back in again and try again because I know that this time for sure.
Oh, the addiction is real.
It's very real. And that's why I sort of opened our conversation by saying, like, this is the most advanced form of video game yet that we know. It is the most potent in its dopamine delivery vector, right?
Okay, so the last question I have for you then is for people who, like myself, have never really gotten into video gaming or haven't tried a roguelike game, would you have one that you'd recommend?
I think that it very much depends on the kinds of games that you like to play already, the affinity you have for certain genres. So, as I said before, roguelikes come in a very, very large variety of flavors and genres. So if you like to play board games, for example, Slay the Spire is a good one. That's a card-building game.
Okay.
But that is one where it is turn-based. It's very strategic because it is turn-based and because it's basically what you have at your disposal. There's no time limit per se.
Okay.
So you can strategize very deeply about what order to play cards in and how to respond to different threats. If you're a fan of more twitchy shooter games, then Enter the Gungeon is a great one.
Yes, I love that punny name, Enter the Gungeon.
It's a funny thing because actually last year there was more than 1,000 roguelike titles released.
That's
into the game
crazy in comparison to previously.
Previously, when it might have been a tenth of that within a couple of years. This is a huge explosion. However, the interesting thing about this is that the vast majority of them, I don't want to say 100%, but in the 90% and above, are released by independent game studios. These are not AAA titles. There's no AAA roguelike that I know of that has made nearly as much impact as small independent game studios run by a handful of people. They release these games for $10, $15.
That's great, though. That's fantastic. I mean, all the power to the small business. And
for sure.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you're a nerd and you want to make a game, this is as you said, the addiction is real. This is a great game.
So it's an interesting contrast. And I'll just leave this with the last thought, is that I think AAA studios have tried to use randomization and tried to use these reward loops through loot boxes or random drops to try and keep people motivated. That is a very primitive way to keep people engaged in a game. Roguelikes have refined engagement to an art form.
I'm going to say they've mastered
this way of engaging people. And if AAA studios ever took these basic tenets of game design and used them in their own games for their own ends to monetize, people's gameplay, again, we may be back to the days of quarter munchers.
Hey.
People will be helpless
against this power,
this technology, this alien technology.
Oh my God! Thank you so much for geeking out with me, Max.
My pleasure.
And thanks, listeners, for tuning into Radio Taiwan International. I hope you try some roguelike games. I'm Michelle Chang, and we'll be back next Thursday with another episode of Geek Out. Bye.